While we are still gathering, and bearing in mind the delay, still we have to finish our work within 60 minutes, because some of us have other business to attend to. I'd like to warn all the participants that we have invented for all of us voting on the topics of our session. So first of all, you have to download the Finopolis application, and please find there the voting platform. So the speakers, I invite you to take your seats on the podium. We will have the voting, and several questions would be voted for, the ones dedicated to the regulation and related to the financial services. And this is not just a game. Sometimes we play such games in the sessions, but this is something which I personally want, and what other stakeholders would like to hear. Your feedback about the problems which you believe are most relevant and most burning for the current stage of the legal framework development. There are several options, and if you deem it possible to vote, we would welcome that very much, and the organizers will help you should it be necessary. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Alexey Guznov. I'm working for the Central Bank of Russia, the main regulator, and I was instructed to moderate that session, which is called Digit and Law. Are we on the train or we are late? Have we made it in time or are we late without the train? And certainly there are certain problems at hand which are related to how the legislation is being drafted, is evolving. And I do think that the speakers will dwell on that, will elaborate on that. Bear in mind that most of them are involved in the national project digital economy. And really, it's become necessary to speak out about those problems. Among the speakers, you may see those who are responsible for the drafting and the implementation of the legal framework, and the ones who may assess to what extent this policy may contribute to the development of business, and those who may assess the whole structure of the legal framework. And each of the speakers can act in several capacities. I would not like to restrict them. Let me introduce them to you. Among the speakers, you may find Anatoly Aksakov, Chairman, Committee on Financial Markets of the State Duma of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation. You can hardly find a law which is not proposed by Mr. Guznov, apart from the bills which are drafted by the State Duma. Actually, all the laws pass through your committee, and this is the committee which is ranked the third in terms of the number of laws which are being discussed. Elena Borisenko, Deputy Chairman of the Board, Gazprombank. We know Elena not only as one of the leaders, top managers of that major financial institution, but she is also an organizer of huge events. She has been involved in Finopolis organization, and 18 months ago, thanks to her contribution, thanks to her active position, thanks to the fact that she managed to bring together within one session several people who were responsible for the development of digital law, digital financial assets, and crowdfunding, we managed to reach an agreement on certain principles to guide us in our work. therefore, an amendment was made to the civil code dedicated to the digital law, and the law on the digital financial assets has not emerged yet, but this is our common trouble. Mr. Zhuravlev, let me introduce him in his new capacity. Since recently, he is the chairman of the Federation Council Committee on Budget and Financial Markets. And let us welcome him in his capacity and congratulate him on his new appointment. For us, it may have certain negative aspects, because before Mr. Zhuravlev was involved in the financial markets and dealt with the regulation there, but now he will have to actually deal more with the fiscal issues, and still I hope that he will not be neglectful of the financial markets. Igor Drozdov, chairman of the board, Skolkovo Foundation, is responsible for many events related to digital economy. Skolkovo Foundation acts as the main hub of those events, and he bears all the responsibility why we fail. And Ms. Medvedeva, last but not least, she is a senior legal advisor, and her role cannot be exaggerated. All the laws related to the securities markets, to the investment funds, and other areas, this is all her domain. And actually, many things were drafted by her personally, and we hope that her proactive legal position, will contribute to the development of the financial markets. So we'll speak about the legislation and regulations. And to some extent, this is necessitated by the programs we are guided by. The national program of the digital economy. It's been said that by 2024, the comprehensive legal framework has to be set up in the relation to the digital economy, and therefore it should contribute favorably to the development of the new digital financial services. This brings me to the first question: are we close to that? What achievements we can boast and what problems we have? Thank you so much, Mr. Guznov. Actually, I have highlighted 4 topics, 4 bullet points, which I'm dealing with. The first block of issues is related to identification, and we'll speak more detailed about that. This is digital workflow. Third, this is the digital sandbox, and the fourth, these are the initiatives related to the non-personal data turnover. So these are the 4 main bullet points, 4 main topics, which are dealt with by those who are involved in making amendments to the legislation in order to adapt the regulation for the needs of the digital economy. But these 4 topics are most burning, most relevant. These are the ones which are related to the financial sector. So these draft laws should bring about the following. I will not exaggerate the role of the legislation for the development of the technologies. In my opinion, the technologies will evolve regardless of what legislation we have. We can certainly facilitate this development and the distribution, but we cannot slow it down. And as the practice shows, most likely these changes will allow us to avoid the gray zones, because actually what we have to do is just to put on paper what is already operational in practice, and the stakeholders feel not comfortable in that sense, believing that they are in the gray zone. So identification and the amendments to be proposed in the area of digital signature. The solution is quite simple. So the remote interaction is quite popular. We all use different banking services remotely. You don't have to be physically present in the bank, and for other areas of our life, we are using different e-services, but still, our legislation stipulates a number of cases when you have to be confident who is on the other side of the network. And in many cases, when we strike deals in the online, actually, we do not know how we're dealing with. And in compliance with Law 115, there are certain cases when identification has to be done. There are certain means of remote interaction through the signature, digital signature, authorized signature, but there are certain procedures which can be helpful in facilitating these channels. Either the identity can be actually confirmed by the MNO, mobile network operator, or actually a cloud signature can be used, or some banking services can be used. According to those who mastermind those bills, they should bring about easier interaction online. The second topic, this is about the digital archives. The amendments were initiated by the banking community because still there are lots of documents, a lot of workflow, paper which has to be stored in compliance with the legislation. Otherwise, actually, these documents could be stored purely digitally. And we are doing that. In terms of the discussion, we could put forward how we can store digital documents, e-documents, and we can discuss the legal force of the electronic documents for all the industries. And we can put forward more requirements for the banking service or sector. This is neither good nor bad, but very often we try to do some patchwork, to put some patches. So the banks say that we'd like to remedy that for themselves, and leaving alone other industries. And when another question arises, are the industries more proactive, lobbying certain amendments? And as a result, we have a patchwork of laws, sometimes very controversial ones, not harmonized. That's why, ideally, we have to bring about certain principles to guide us in our work, and we're very close to bringing about such principles related to the e-documents. And especially we can set certain requirements for the banking sector. The risks which are pertinent to that area are obvious. This is something we cannot deal with very quickly. And there are questions related to the safety and security of storing digital documents. Many believe that hard copies are more reliable, and actually there are risks of fraudulent activity, that certain corrections and changes can be introduced to the electronic documents. And I do think that very soon we will offer a compromise to adopt such a basic legislation. The third item I'd like to touch upon is about the sandbox. This is a very important topic, really, where we cannot agree right now on the amendments for the whole of the country. We can do some pilot projects, testing certain technologies in a limited scope. It's very important to understand that there are three integral features of a sandbox. First of all, this is for strict legislation for some period of time, not a permanent one. Secondly, these rules would be applicable not to all the citizens of the Russian Federation, but only to a certain number of companies and physical persons. And thirdly, this is about some limited scope, meaning that these rules and principles will be applicable to a certain city or to a certain region, but not to the whole territory of the country. These are the integral features of, or mandatory features of a sandbox. If there is no limitation as to the number of people involved, this is not the sandbox. When we say that actually we offer something which is applicable to all the citizens, but which will be applicable only for 3 years, still this is not a sandbox. This is just an amendment to the legislation. We can use this regimen in order to test different technologies in real time, in real-life conditions, and afterwards we can make conclusions whether such a regulation can be copy and pasted and made permanent. And last but not least, and this is probably even the hottest topic, the most burning topic of the turnover of the non-personal data. Everyone actually speaks about artificial intelligence, which has become a buzzword. And the artificial intelligence needs lots of data, big data. And those who are dealing with those technologies are very much interested. And it should be done without the need of some extra requirements from the physical persons. But at the same time, in other words, these documents and this data should not require any consent of the physical person, but it should not be infringing the privacy laws of these people, which were put forward several decades ago and which actually serve as the foundation of the so-called European values. So these data cannot be used in order to identify the person. But the legislation provides a very broad notion, and even non-sensitive data sometimes are considered to be private information or personal information. And we have to fine-tune the legislation. And its adoption should be accompanied by an outreach campaign. We have to explain the goals which we pursue. We need these non-personal data not to keep track of someone or to enrich major companies, but this is about to bring about new services and improving the life for the people. This is what we have to focus on within that outreaching campaign. And besides, we have to raise public awareness as to what privacy means in the 21st century. I think that the privacy which we enjoyed in the 20th century is totally unmanageable in the 21st century. No matter how stringent the legislation is, there is such a catchphrase that stringent legislation actually is offset by the non-binding manner of many of the items of the legislation. And I don't think that we should boast that For instance, we have adopted a stringent legislation which actually prohibits the use of the personal data. This is not a guarantee of data leakage. We have to improve the cybersecurity systems rather than actually making the legislation more stringent. So the legislation contains the items which are purely enforceable, rather than there should be no gap between the rule of and the law. Otherwise, it will not bring us to anything good. These are the main topics which are there on the agenda. And in my opinion, it's quite realistic that before the end of the spring session of the parliament, these laws would be adopted.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your optimistic outlook on many issues. And many of us have been discussing this topic for a longer period of time. And I think I wouldn't be talking about everyone, but I would like to ask you one question dedicated to the last issue, the last question of personal data. That's the problem which is connected with the status of a human being, because that is not more of a legal problem, it is more of an ethical problem. And from this standpoint, in modern times, are we to talk about managing personal data and providing opportunities to people to consciously make decisions on managing this data, or to differentiate human beings and their data from using the data which can be utilized for business development goals? What is your point of view in this regard? So in my point of view, I'm not an advocate of implementing the model which is currently being implemented in Europe from the standpoint of personal data management. And the point of making it a certain asset which belongs to a human being and which can be monetized, from my standpoint, is not that useful for a person. And those companies which will be acquiring those data, they will include afterwards it in the cost of their services, and eventually a person is the one to pay for those services, and he will acquire nothing at the end. So I think monetization of data from this standpoint within such a framework doesn't have any kind of serious perspectives, and also establishes additional businesses which involve mediators, which will be following the way this data is used, and they don't have any added value created. So from my standpoint, a person needs to have an opportunity to be aware of the fact how and where these data are located, who possesses them, if we are talking about personal data. And another case is when we talk about impersonification of this data. So when we're not talking about this matching, when we have first name, last name, and everything else disintegrated from that, if we have disintegrated information about certain likings of a certain person without his or her name, and this person is living somewhere, so I don't know how this information can be used, and I don't know whether it is expedient for a physical entity to know about that, because I think it is a kind of information which is needed for creation of services and products, and which is needed for the creation of products in the field of artificial intelligence. And I think it is to be done without participation of people. And it is important to know for a person that this data has become impersonal and they are circulated in such a manner. Thank you very much. I'm not continuing the discussion in such a manner afterwards, because I would like to pay attention to the fact that the organizers asked us to specify the way to the poll. You can use our application, our section, and on the left part you can see poll section, and when you press it, you will see the questions which have been put forward for the participants of this session. And our next question is addressed to Elena Borisenko. As I have said, you're a representative of a large-scale financial institution, and a lot of questions which are connected with the development of financial technologies are within the framework of your activities. Maybe the institution is not positioned as one of the super drivers or locomotives in this field, but nevertheless, a lot of topics, a lot of problems are connected with your professional activity, and you're dealing with them personally as well. So my question is the following: how do financial technologies, and in which field can they diminish expenditures for business? How can they provide a helping hand to business? And my question is connected with this fact, and how can law be useful in this regard as well? Thank you very much for your question. As always, you are very sensitive and wise in terms of naming the prize, naming the session, and approaching the issue. Because the issue is whether we are on time as law to help our business to earn money, and whether we are on time or are late, are lagging behind. And my outlook is the following. I have seen that one of my colleagues was disappointed that Gazprombank doesn't have drivers of innovations, but I think that in the run of the recent 18 or 24 months, Gazprombank was trying hard to do that. So I beg your pardon for saying that. Well, no, I'm very happy about that, because that's a discussion which is held almost during all the committees of our banks, and which is being developed among us, because where is the balance of business interest and quite a significant conservative, risk-oriented approach? That has always been a key issue when a new product is issued. So my personal point of view as of a legal expert, first and foremost, and after that as of a bank employee, is that law is not to catch up with anything. It is to be responsive to the challenges of time and to have a look at the relations which are being developed, and to a certain extent to be a bit disintegrated in terms of providing state, public and business those models which will provide for sustainable development. And from this standpoint, and if we talk about digital economy, and Mr. Drozdov is always a colleague of ours, and a lawyer usually often faces a kind of Stockholm syndrome, because when we talk about Roman law and when we remember Roman law, if we have a look at Roman legal constructions and have them compared with modern realities, we will see them perfectly fit in that and perfectly responsive to modern challenges. And I think that the key challenge for all of us who are dealing with the development of modern law is connected with the establishment of regulation models which will give long life and development and of technologies and provide appropriate climate for their development, but not be responsive to short-term interests, because we do remember conferences dedicated to blockchains and a myriad of such conferences, and now it has become not the trendy, and now it is just an appropriate, solid technology which can be utilized by many fields. So what do I think? What is an important at this crossroad? We do remember that the Civil Code has faced several amendments, and they have been mentioned, and we have different views in terms of digital economy estimates from the standpoint of the importance of regulation which has been embedded. And my personal view is that that is quite a considerate text for modern times, which was created and was adopted. And I think that if we talk about principles we have mentioned, it has founded all the principles for the development, because it has eliminated all the hindrances and barriers and gave us further opportunities to work in business and in other fields, to work without submerging into some individual elements of civil code. And I highly evaluate the amendments which have been adopted, and I think that the road to digital economy and amendments to the civil code have been quite timely. And what do I think to be very important? What do I think to be a key point for us to be able to be always in time? We have subject and object and regulation, which are the parts of any relations. And as soon as we start talking about technologies, as soon as we start talking about modern challenges, we are talking about remoteness. How can we remotely provide different services to a vast number of people or legal entities? And my first question, the first question which any lawyer faces who thinks in a negative way, how can one avoid fraud, any kind of fraud, for these relations to be legal, for Sidorov not to mention that he's Ivanov, and Ivanov not to say that he's Petrov, and so on and so forth. So we're talking about the problem of identification, and sometimes whole professions are dedicated to that, because if we remember about notary public, then one of the key goals of notary is to define a subject and his will, what is its aim and what is his goal in entering any kind of relation. And when we are talking about civil document circulation, we are talking first and foremost about this identification, which is divided into separate points. I know that we are short of time and we can talk about that for long, but these are, in a nutshell, initiatives which are connected with e-signature and e-documents. And indeed, there are a lot of crossroads there and a lot of variations there, and part of them is supported by the majority in terms of putting identification centers to order and in terms of recognition of e-signatures which are issued by those centers. And there is a huge topic which was mentioned by Mr. Drozdov as well, that's e-environment and e-document flow, and currently it is quite far away from being ready for those goals, because there are a lot of legal issues which are connected with the relativeness of those documents, with their authenticity, where the barriers are, what the terms for storage are, how to eliminate the fraud which is connected with fake documents, identification and endorsements, and loss of original document, which was the source for the fake copy. So there are a lot of issues, and for us to understand, just to understand, that's a very important issue, the crucial one. And the third major initiative within the framework of digital economy, as I see it for the nearest future, and it is to be introduced for the discussion of the governmental commission, is the law on identification and law on identification, which is connected with the relative articles of the civil code. And that is, as I see it, a kind of a serious challenge for us and for the way we are trying to pursue and we are trying to choose, because there are some extremes. There are always some extremes, and some governmental representatives also are tempted to have overall regulation and identification in all fields of e-life. And as I see it, if we talk about such extremes, they will lead us to absurd, because we are living in the modern world. We all use our mobile phones and applications. We buy via those applications, and we use identification methods which are already installed in those devices, and it can't be changed by acting Russian regulation. That's the objective reality we have, and it will be developing further regardless of the fact that we adopt certain laws. And on the other hand, if Russia has extremely harsh regulation from the standpoint of civil entities, our business will just move abroad, and modern technological companies will create their applications and e-platforms abroad. And we are to make something to have the contrary situation as a result, for us to have a comfortable environment for work and development. And from this standpoint, it seems to me that all speakers who are present here today, and I would like to address all of you, both the speakers and the audience, it's very important for all of us to pay attention to this initiative, because if we divide correctly public digital profile connected with provision of state services and most crucial activities for citizens and identifications which are needed for commercial flow, if we divide that and if we do that appropriately, then we will be on time, indeed on time, and we will be doing that basing on the objective reality of our modern time. Thank you. Thank you very much, and I do agree with your first statements that law is not to catch up with digital sphere. These are individual spheres. They are to interact with each other, to cooperate with each other, and as you have said, to propose models for having sustainable development of society all in all. And talking about your last statement, really this legislative draft is very important, and the topic is very relevant, because facilitating this procedure for a bank is also facilitating its interaction and relations with the client. But what will it give to a consumer of financial services? Are there any bonuses for him in this process? Thank you very much. And I think that in the longer term, the bank or a bank or an organization which do provide interesting protected services will be economically efficient and demanded, and there is no secret that we are paying a lot of attention to that in our field. And what do I think to be important? I think that there are some things which have already become part of our reality. We have legislation dedicated to personal data, which stipulates that if we talk about important personal data, then there is a must for a written agreement, and written agreement is also appropriate in the field of e-documentation. But every time we see the introduction of certain practices, business practices connected with certain preliminary approval of any service and a desire of a customer to have everything even before he has applied with his written agreement. And if we talk about certain kind of important issues, also significant from the financial standpoint, then we need to preserve a conservative way of regulation. But to a certain extent, if a consumer is willing to provide his or her agreement, for instance, for an application to a loan bureau, to a credit bureau, on a pre-agreement basis, if he is willing to understand what is the overall range of services which can be provided to him or her, and if he is able to negotiate and to agree upon identification methods which are okay for both sides together with the bank and which are also in compliance with current requirements of civil code in terms of identification of a physical entity, then I think it is expedient that such an opportunity to find mutual agreement is in place, because the bank, it is favorable for a bank because some processes will be facilitated, but of course the real beneficiary is a citizen and a physical entity. So we'll hope that it will be the case. Thank you very much for your comment. Mr. Aksakov, my question is to you. You have heard our speakers and their opinions. You have heard the topics. What is your agenda, and which such legislative drafts and which complexities do emerge within the pace of the discussion of such legislative drafts, because some topics have been discussed for years and we don't see any final decision yet. So I will reveal a secret. We were flying together with Sergei yesterday, and I gave him my notes with questions he was going to ask me and answers I was going to give, which were prepared by the Bank of Russia, and I was to voice them, but Mr. Guznov hasn't seen those notes and those documents, so I think that I will allow myself to talk about something which is beyond the framework of preliminary answers, because everything is okay there, but quite from the narrow standpoint. So I will talk about the processes we're having at the moment and about legislative drafts we're going to scrutinize. Yesterday, the committee received a document from the government of Russia, and it was positively evaluated from the standpoint of the legislative draft and amendments which have been proposed in terms of the unified information system establishment and to check telephone numbers of our subscribers, and that was a legislative draft which has faced a lot of hindrances and hurdles, and now it is facing the finish line, and everything which is proposed by the government will be taken into account during the second reading and will be amended, because the Ministry of Digital Development and the Bank of Russia also have a certain kind of a different vision. And I think that in the run of the discussion, which will be held next week, we will invite telephone operators for them to voice their point of view, and in the run of the discussion we will come up to a final conclusion. So that's the term we have, November.
And all the necessary factors are there, but the deadline for the implementation of that law is about 2 years. So enough time for the MNOs and the banks to get prepared. One of the norms there says that this is mandatory for the banks. And the bankers say, why actually binding us to do that? Because this is actually in their best interest to check the phone number of the clients who are applying to them. But making that binding, it means that they will have to set up necessary infrastructure and incur major expenditures. This was the proposition made by the government, and probably the time frame which we will propose for that law would be quite comfortable for the lending organizations, and we'll agree with that. My personal opinion there is that it should not be mandatory. It should be the option which can be used by any institution, by any organization. Second thing, this is about the authorization centers. We actually had several discussions on the digital signature within my committee. In the first half of 2017 and the first part of this year, we have identified more than 30,000 abusers which actually engaged an authorized signature. There are two different approaches. The market approach, which states that once the requirements to the authorization centers are becoming more rigid, still the institutions which are there in the market, they have to authorize the signatures and confirm the signatures of the physical persons and the legal entities. For your information, this week we met with the representatives of the market, those who actively work in that market. We met the tax authorities, and we met them halfway to allow the markets, the institutions which are fully compliant with that law, and the tax authority to do that work altogether. And it's very much possible that next week we'll have another meeting at which we will endorse the documents to put on record that compromise, to put forward to promote the law, which actually we were about to discuss and scrutinize back in July, but we took a break in order to take into consideration the feedback from the banking sector. That's why we will convene one more meeting of the committee. We'll consider the question and actually we will meet the requirements of the market. Secondly, biometrics features. A law has been passed in the first reading which expands the use of the biometric data not only to make deposits but also to make money transfer. Amendments suggest that we can use biometric data for the non-financial market too. When you apply for public services, and there are certain questions, and Mr. Guznov asked me to tell you about the problem. So there are certain bottlenecks. For instance, how to pass over the accumulated biometrical data to the single or unified biometrical database. You know what questions may rise there. And the second question is related to the fact that almost all the banks' branches will have to have necessary technical equipment to use the biometrical data. The banks say that there is no demand for that, and this is not an option. The citizens are reluctant to provide their biometrical data. The banks sent a consolidated letter to the State Duma, and they said that about 10,000 clients only offered their biometrical data, so there is no major inflow of the clients. The clients are not lining up to deliver their biometrical data, so it should not be made mandatory. So we'll discuss that, and certainly we'll consider this opinion of the banking community through the prism of the regulations. I think that in the upcoming 2 weeks we will discuss that, engaging the bankers, the regulator, and we'll try to bring about a common stance. As for the marketplace is concerned, the amendments are ready. They have been agreed upon in the competent structures, and I assume that next week we will actually send these amendments to the competent bodies so that they could endorse them. Again, we expand the market of the marketplaces. And so the marketplaces would be used not only for the banking services, but also for all the markets, such as the insurance market, the securities market. These amendments, they cover everything. So the digital workflow, we have discussed that with Igor and with the Bank of Russia. It's been discussed in the State Duma as well, and I just made a preliminary submission of that document, but the notary chamber, the representatives, they criticized that, as well as the power-wielding ministries. They criticized that too, and we even wanted to make a bill concerning only the banking sector, because the banks, they need very much that law. They made a huge progress in that area. But as the experience shows, we have to specify some general approaches too, and it can be followed by the industry-wide law. Skolkovo has prepared that document, and we have disseminated that in the notary chamber as the most trusted center, the center which certifies the signature. They offered a less revolutionary approach, less disruptive approach than the one which has been proposed. Concerning what Mr. Gref mentioned at the plenary session, bringing together the regulations, the Ministry of the Interior and the MNO's efforts to check the phones with the fake threats. Now, the criminals, they are actually abusing the statement which stipulates that, for instance, a transaction is disrupted following this or that federal law because of an attempted unauthorized access to the banking account. And the MNOs now may identify whether the phone call is made from a bank or is made by a criminal, not from the bank's phone number. And they can filter those phone numbers. This is what we're going to do. And even if we meet some resistance, we'll even insist that the efforts are brought together, that the phone calls can be sieved, so to say, and that we can bring order to that situation. And so we can have to raise the liability for all these things. And Mr. Gref was very right. And you remember that a law was adopted in the first reading on blocking the websites which are abusing some phishing services. And we agreed with the Committee on Digital to facilitate the adoption of that law. So we have to raise the liability on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have to pull together our efforts to filter the criminals' phone numbers. When we start speaking about the liability, sadly, there is administrative liability and criminal liability, but there is one more liability which causes lots of questions. We discussed that with Mr. Sychov about compensating the damage, including the moral one, to those who actually fell victim to such a crime. Such a liability is not enshrined in the legislation, and actually instead of an automobile lawyers, we will see the emergence of the cyber lawyers who will actually make data leakages and would earn money on that. Thank you so much. Thank you, Anatoly. Aksakov, actually, the questions which you have raised are clearly very important, and from the standpoint of statistics, we did have 10,000 applications to the unified biometrical database. Actually, the figure rose to 50,000, and people who actually wrote that letter, they are not fully familiar with the situation. It happens. I see that you are quite conscious about setting up a unified support center for the MNOs and for the unified biometrical database. We have accumulated certain contractual database and certain biometrical systems operational in a number of financial institutions. But at the same time, setting up unified systems will somehow level up and even the terms of competition. Means that many financial institutions may access these services. Do you think that this is an achievable goal or not? Even German Gref is standing up for that. He said that they are not against sharing the information. So I do believe that, especially engaging the Bank of Russia, we have to set up an infrastructure which will allow small and medium-sized financial institutions to take advantage of the high-tech systems which are available in the market, including the systems which provide for the cybersecurity. This area, this direction should be a key one for the Bank of Russia. The fast-track payment system is on the rise, and the cybersecurity system can be set up, which will engage small and medium-sized financial institutions which cannot afford such high-tech systems, where they really have to do that to comply with the legislation. And the Bank of Russia is very much interested in maintaining the competitiveness of these institutions. Thank you so much. You finished your presentation. Turning to the topic of liability and responsibility, I think that this is how you reacted to the risks which arise when we use financial services, and these risks are felt in many regions. I have a question to Mr. Zhuravlev. Your chamber is the Chamber of Regions, at least this is how you position yourself, and how our citizens living in the regions, for instance, in Kostroma region, how do they perceive these new technologies? What risks are there, and what should be done to somehow diminish those risks, to mitigate those risks? Mr. Guznov, actually, this is not how we position ourselves. This is enshrined in the Constitution. We are really the Chamber of Regions, and bear in mind that our committees are working in close cooperation with what Mr. Aksakov does. Actually, he ate most of my bread. I also wanted to dwell on what he has already said. Bear in mind that me and Tatyana have only 2 minutes together, actually. I do think that we do not have to be together on the same podium next time, either me or him. Back to the bill made by some of our participants on website blocking. There are 4 bullet points were positions related to the pyramids, the so-called phishing and malicious software, and the gray landing. So the first 3 items imply out-of-court procedures. We know that actually the in-court decisions or court's ruling actually require several months of time, and Cash-Bay and many other pyramids, they incur multi-billion ruble losses. But we believe that this should be a decision by the Bank of Russia, by the governor, but it should be an out-of-court decision. Unfortunately, this bill is discussed not in Mr. Aksonov's committee. That's why it takes so much time to scrutinize that. And we hope that in the nearest future, this bill will be ready for the second reading. Thank you so much for contributing to bringing together the positions within the State Duma. We do believe that within the same bill, we have to address the questions related to wrong information about the financial institutions on the heads of the financial institutions. And probably you will not support that, but actually this law should also address the wrong information about the governor. For instance, when we read in the mass media that the heads of the financial institution, the governor, have migrated and brought abroad all the golden reserves of the Russian Federation, certainly this undermines the financial sustainability of the system. And we have to address the question related to unfair advertisement. We all know that the financial institutions and the stakeholders are competing for the clients, and some online companies, they benefit from that. When we Google, for instance, one company, and instead we get advertisements of dozens of other companies. And this is about disillusionment. And it not only increases the advertisement costs of the financial institutions, the costs which are borne by the consumer at the end of the day. This is beneficial only to the online companies. And I do think that the number of the advertisements on one page should be limited, and actually it should warn in block letters that this is an advertisement. Also, the fast-track payment system. I actually support the work which was done by the Bank of Russia following the legislation which we adopted in terms of the system development. But let me remind you that this system was created for the sake of antitrust purposes, to bring about a competition in that market against one of the stakeholders which held 90% stake in P2P market. As for P2P is concerned, actually, we are ready to support that. But in terms of B2B competition, actually, there is no monopoly of one stakeholder. The competition is there. That's why I'd like to ask the Central Bank of Russia not to forget about that and focus on the markets, on the payments, which have certain features of unfair competition. We don't see any clear-cut support of the central bank in terms of using that system for the payroll purposes in order to eradicate the so-called payroll slavery. The fast-track payment systems, including the aggregate limits and the daily limits, certainly not always the stakeholders can agree on the terms of these payments, and we need to bring order to the internal regulation. Also, I'd like to remind you that in summer, we adopted a law to authorize the Central Bank of Russia to determine when the too big to fail banks may actually put forward these systems, but nothing happened, and the regulator has to be more specific in their position.
Also, the central bank has an opportunity to regulate the acquiring cost, and if needed, and I hope that the central bank will not use this non-market tool, but I think that it is another point for an ability to use this system for interactions between human beings and business, for settlements, first and foremost. And I would like to briefly comment on what has been said in connection with telephone subscribers checks. I think it is to be voluntary, either voluntary or free of charge, because if it is mandatory and payable, I think it leads to a kind of a distortion, because we do know very well that certain players do negotiate with mobile operators, telephone operators, and have good tariffs provided, and all others have an increased rate for that. And talking about biometrics, I would like to say that here, as it has been mentioned during the panel, we first and foremost we need to have an agreement on behalf of a client, because banks are able to regulate this agreement all the time and how to get it from a client, and also how to talk a client off. So I think it's a kind of a cunning approach. And you need to be quite delicate here, because we can't, in the run of several months or even in the run of the year, introduce a completely new complicated process, especially when we talk about clients who are physical entities, and they can have different stances in terms of the provision of their biometrics. And of course, we can't have any kind of mandatory measures to enter such system via beneficial or via different benefits or benefit reserves, because if a credit is provided with the use of biometrics, if biometrics has been collected, so they have some benefits in terms of rates provided. So I think it is not in compliance with any basic approaches to regulation. So in a nutshell, this is it. I have commented everything which has been voiced previously. Thank you very much. So we can't but invite you together to such events, because we see the stances of both the lower and the upper chambers of the parliament. So now, and they're quite different. So we do understand why all legislative drafts are being endorsed for such a long period of time. But of course, it's a joke. Thank you very much for your contribution in the development of legislation, and it's quite significant. And on behalf of the central bank, we also completely support the initiative you have mentioned in terms of an opportunity to use prompt payment system to overcome salary slavery, and legislative amendments which were brought forward in 2014 were insufficient. So I think some steps are needed as well, and prompt payment system was launched on the 1st of October. So decisive, tough steps are needed, which are being made, but I can't mention them right now publicly, because for it to become an overall situation and for all the main players to join this system, it needs some time to be unfolded. And allow me to take some time, because I was quite worried about the information connected with site blockages, and there have been several proposals to include rumor spreading in this model. And there has been such a legislative draft, if you remember, and it was withdrawn because it is connected with negative rumors, unchecked rumors, and the danger they incur. And how dangerous is it really? Because in the run of 9 months, 2019, the service which is dealing with information technologies platform has mentioned that there are 9,000 domains, and approximately 4,000 of them were included in the list. So talking about the fact, the clients are deceived and a consumer is to suffer. And so maybe we will be able to discuss that in a more peaceful mode, I think, a little bit later. Nikolay. So was it a question? Yes, it was a question. Well, actually, it's difficult to measure it in units. Let us measure that in rubles, because in the run of this time when it was being blocked, we need to understand how much money was stolen and where it is. So in this case, we will be able to understand the real danger. And talking about the rumors you have mentioned, it's quite complicated to measure it all in all, because it seems to me that you, the central bank, possess expertise and experience to assess and evaluate a financial state of any institution or organization, I think. So maybe it is not the most appropriate thing for a legal panel, but I think even the court doesn't have such an expertise as the central bank does in terms of evaluation of financial stability of different organizations. So I think undoubtedly your opinion is the key one in terms of whether we are talking about the rumors or not. So I think it is evident that these things are to be promoted further, maybe not in this legislative draft, not to have it drowned, but this topic is to be discussed undoubtedly. Thank you very much. So colleagues were approaching me and asking about gold and currency reserves taken away. But we don't understand that these people are educated ones, but still they do believe in some rumors from time to time. And so, Tatyana, we are short of time, but of course I can't but ask you. You were the one of the authors of a legislative bill and the author of a text of a bill on crowdfunding and investment platform, and it was adopted, endorsed, and it is ready to come into force. And are there any business projects which will give an opportunity for this technology to develop further? How is business mastering them from the standpoint of digital law? Do you have any information? So I will try to reach the Canadian border in the run of this short period of time I have. And second, of course, I'm a lawyer, and maybe I have heard something, such projects do exist, but I can't say to what extent they're going to be successful or not. I only can say a couple of things. I only can mention a couple of things. And first and foremost, I'd like to thank everyone who is taking part in this session, all the speakers, because all of them were taking an active part for this law to come into force on the 2nd of August. And I would also like to thank everyone who is sitting in the hall, who also were taking an active part in the promotion of this legislative draft. And it has come into force already. And for the first time, we see the emergence of real digital rights, which were stipulated only in general terms by the civil code, and for them to emerge, there was a need to adopt a law, and such law emerged. And what is a peculiar trait of utilitarian digital rights? First and foremost, they emerge, live and die only in a particular system which is administered by an operator. There is no other way for their existence. If we talk about selling or circulation or allocation, something which is similar to digital rights, then it is an analog, but it is the rules for transfer and transition are not applicable to them, and rules for protection as well, which are now covering only utilitarian digital rights, and that's a specific type of property. And the main part of the civil code, which on the one hand gives us an opportunity to apply general rules which are applied to property and property rights, to digital rights, and on the other hand to have a law on peculiar traits of the existence of these rights. And so I don't have any time left to talk in details how they are applied and how they emerge. I would like to reiterate that they do emerge only within the framework of the system, and acquiring such rights, acquisition of such rights is rigidly regulated by law. But I would like to say what we still lack, what can be used today or tomorrow, for instance, since the 1st of January 2020, and what is not still there. So digital rights can be included in bankruptcy mass and distributed and covered by the requirements of the bankruptcy law. And we also can talk about the emergence of taxation from the profit which emerges in connection with the existence of these digital rights. And at the same time, digital rights are specific rights from the standpoint of their circulation. They're quite similar to financial assets, and the most important difference of these rights from securities is that they emerge without application to the third party. The users of this platform, without the participation of third parties, can make transactions with those rights, can acquire those rights, and can transfer them. And there are no special tax benefits for such a kind of a quasi-financial asset are not in place, but we can use the idea, which is also stipulated in law, that financial digital assets can be the foundation for the emergence of derivatives. And securities are such derivatives, and these securities can be covered by all the rules which exist in the field of securities, including the taxation field. The next issue, which has remained unresolved, and I think will remain unresolved in the nearest future if we talk purely about utilitarian digital rights without their transformation in digital documents. That's the way how we can access, how we can reach this property to resolve all the issues which are connected with penalties incurred, and these issues remain unresolved, because if a person has access to the wallet and if this person is unwilling to say what the code is, this problem will remain unresolved, at least for the time being, for the nearest future, for January the 1st, when the law is to come into force. And another problem, or maybe not the problem, but the challenge to a regulator, as soon as we see the emergence of utilitarian digital rights, they will be provided by financial mediators. And how will a bank be able to address this challenge? How will financial mediators' activity be regulated when such digital rights are proposed? So the question is still open and still there. So I think this is it in a nutshell, because I don't have any time left. Thank you very much once again. Thank you very much for your comment. Actually, it's very important from the standpoint of the promotion of new technologies, of the promotion of distributed ledger technology as well. And maybe the trend is not there anymore, but the needs of business are still there. So I'm very sorry to say that the law on digital assets is lagging behind a bit. I think that without these models, we won't see the full capacity of the process. But we still hope that we will be able to adopt the law on digital assets during the session. So the central bank gives its consent, so maybe. But I have a kind of déjà vu. I think we had such a session a year ago in this particular hall, and we were discussing the same things. So almost same speakers, but we were much more inspired that we are going to adopt it in the nearest future. So I was asking the question, what are the hindrances for the development? I know that there is a different state institution which has quite a tough stance. So the central bank is to have a flexible stance. But it seems to me that since then, the text has been amended greatly, and now it has a different quality. And I think that now we have a law which is quite sophisticated and elaborated. So now we see the results of the poll, and so we see that there is number one priority, digital financial assets, at least on behalf of our audience. I would like to thank you for these things. New technologies, new digital technologies are really challenge to the legal sphere, and lawyers are to consider that. And it's not only the issue of identification and the use of new models, which will facilitate and simplify remote services. It is also about interaction, the whole scope of interactions with the client. We talk about law, we talk about the new quality of interactions, where we are maybe to talk about non-subject relations. That's a new situation, completely new one, and we need to get used to that. And I hope that joint effort will help us to overcome all the difficulties. Thank you very much.